14,000 men walking across an open field toward 9,000 rifles, already aimed. The general who ordered this knew the ground was wrong. He'd been told by the man he trusted most. That morning, in those exact words, he ordered it anyway. I've spent years studying military command failures, and what makes Gettysburg different from most battlefield disasters is this. The information was there, the warnings were there. Lee simply chose not to use them. That distinction matters more than people realize. The question isn't whether Robert E. Lee was brave. The question is, what kind of mind sends 14,000 men across open ground toward 9,000 rifles and calls it strategy? That question has a concrete answer, and the answer is going to change what you thought you knew. Two mysteries, both planted now, both resolved before this ends. Mystery 1. How does a general win battle after battle and still bleed his own army into extinction? Second Bull Run, Fredericksburg, Chancellorsville, victory after victory, and the army dying anyway. Mystery 2. July 3rd, 1863. Every senior officer around Lee told him the charge couldn't succeed. He ordered it anyway. Why? And what does that one decision reveal about every decision he ever made? We'll come back to both, because what they reveal changes the entire story. Here's something most Civil War documentaries skip over. Before we talk about what Lee got wrong, we have to be honest about what he got right. Because if we don't, nothing that comes after makes sense. Robert Edward Lee arrived at West Point at 18 with a famous name and empty pockets. His father, Light Horse Harry Lee, was a Revolutionary War cavalry hero and a friend of George Washington. He'd also died in debt and disgrace. Robert had watched that. He made a decision before he ever set foot on the Hudson. He would not repeat it. In 4 years at West Point, he received 0 demerits. Not one. In an institution where other cadets broke rules constantly, where William Tecumseh Sherman accumulated dozens of demerits, where Ulysses Grant barely passed, Lee was untouchable. What does 0 demerits actually tell us? It tells us Lee had iron self-control, the same self-control that would later convince him, wrongly, that he could control battlefields the same way. A man who never lost a personal discipline contest started to believe he could never lose a strategic one either. That's my read. And the evidence at Gettysburg supports it. 0 isn't just discipline. 0 is a statement about character. 0 means every time a weaker man took a shortcut, Lee didn't. Every time comfort offered itself, he refused it. He graduated second in his class, assigned to the elite corps of engineers. He spent the next 17 years building things. Fort Pulaski, Fort Monroe, the Mississippi River Channel at St. Louis, all with the same patience and precision he'd brought to West Point. In 1861, this same man sat down and wrote a letter. One letter. The words he chose would seal the fate of hundreds of thousands of soldiers who would never read it. We'll come back to that letter, because what it actually says is not what the mythology remembers. In 1846, at age 39, Captain Robert E. Lee encountered real war for the first time. What he found there would shape his command decisions for the next 20 years, and not entirely in ways that served him. At the Battle of Cerro Gordo, General Winfield Scott faced an obstacle his engineers called impassable. The Pedregal, a miles-wide field of razor-sharp volcanic rock. No army could cross it undetected, they said. Lee volunteered to check. He crossed it alone, scouted the route, came back, then crossed it again, leading troops through darkness. The flanking maneuver that followed destroyed Santa Anna's position. Scott wrote afterward that Lee's reconnaissance was the greatest feat of physical and moral courage performed by any individual in his knowledge. At Contreras, Lee stayed awake for 36 hours straight. He personally guided multiple assault columns through unfamiliar terrain in the dark. He was brevetted 3 times in 2 years, captain to brevet lieutenant colonel. The Pedregal at night isn't just dark, it's a field designed to break ankles and shred boots. Every step requires total attention. Lee crossed it twice, in darkness, with enemy patrols nearby. Whatever else this man was, on that night in 1847, he was genuinely extraordinary. Here is what I think Mexico actually did to Lee. It taught him that bold personal action could override impossible odds. It taught him that the aggressive move, the one everyone else said couldn't work, was usually the right one. In Mexico, that lesson was correct. In Virginia in 1863, against a Union army that had learned to fight back, it became a trap. The brilliance and the blindness came from the same source, same lesson, different war. When the Civil War began, Scott offered Lee command of the entire Union Army. More than 75,000 men, the most powerful military force on the continent. Lee turned it down. He resigned his commission on April 20th, 1861. He wrote to his sister, "With all my devotion to the Union, I have not been able to make up my mind to raise my hand against my relatives, my children, my home." That is the steel man. A man of genuine excellence choosing a side, choosing it for reasons that felt real to him. And in doing so, pointing all of that excellence toward a cause built on human slavery. He wasn't a fraud. He wasn't a coward. He was brilliant, which means what comes next isn't a story about incompetence. It's a story about how a specific kind of genius becomes the most destructive possible tool when aimed at the wrong strategic target. The moment Lee stopped being a general and started being a gambler. Every war documentary focuses on generals. I want you to also hold the name Francis Bowen, because the decisions Lee made didn't happen in a vacuum. They happened to specific men. Men with wives in corn harvests and children with coughs. Yadkin County, North Carolina, September 1861. Francis Bowen, 23 years old, signs the 28th North Carolina Infantry muster roll. His hands smell like turned earth. He hasn't slept. His wife stood in the doorway until he rounded the bend and she couldn't see him anymore. He's not enlisting for ideology. He's enlisting because every other man on his road is enlisting. In Yadkin County in 1861, a young man who stays home needs a better reason than he has. He signs it. F.A. Bowen, Private. By Gettysburg, he'll be a sergeant. The promotion comes from outliving the men above him. That's a fact that deserves to sit for a moment. Before we get to the battle, there's something you need to understand about the war Lee was actually fighting. Because it wasn't the war he thought it was. And that gap, between the war he thought he was in and the war he was actually in, is where the entire Confederate defeat lives. The Union didn't need to defeat Lee. It needed to outlast him. In 1861, the North controlled 92% of United States iron production, 97% of firearms manufacturing, 22 million free people. The South had 9 million people total, 4 million of them enslaved. One major railroad hub. No ocean-going navy. Lincoln's strategy, eventually refined by Grant, was attrition. Use the North's industrial and demographic superiority to make the war too expensive for the Confederacy to continue. Lee's counter-strategy, bleed the North so badly that Northern voters forced a negotiated peace. To do that, he needed dramatic offensive victories on Northern soil. Not just wins, spectacles, events that shook public confidence in Washington. The fatal problem, every offensive battle, no matter how victorious, cost Confederate blood that couldn't be replaced. I call this the invisible tax on Confederate victory. Every win came with a bill attached. And the bill was always higher than the invoice Lee sent to Richmond. Because he was counting enemy casualties. He wasn't counting what his own men's deaths cost the South's replacement capacity. Those are two different ledgers. Lee only looked at one of them. Lee understood this in the abstract. He wrote about it. But when he stood on a battlefield with the enemy in front of him, the abstract always lost. A general knows his strategy is costing his men more than the enemy's strategy is costing theirs. But each individual battle feels winnable. Does he change the strategy, or trust the next battle to be different? This is not a rhetorical question. It's the question Lee faced after every single engagement. Lee's 7 days plan was audacious. Coordinate Stonewall Jackson's corps sweeping around McClellan's right while A.P. Hill attacked frontally. Perfect convergence, on paper. Here is what I find most revealing about the 7 days. Lee designed a plan that required perfect timing across 25 miles with no reliable communication. He built in zero margin for human error. That's not a plan. That's a prayer dressed up as a plan. And it's a pattern you will see repeat itself. Jackson was 25 miles away. He was supposed to arrive at dawn. He didn't arrive at dawn. He didn't arrive at noon. He didn't arrive by 3 in the afternoon. A.P. Hill waited as long as a man can wait when 15,000 soldiers know they're supposed to be moving. Then he attacked without orders. Hill's men charged, a prepared Union position, at Beaver Dam Creek. 1,484 Confederate casualties. Union losses, 361. The ground east of Beaver Dam Creek was flat and open. Union artillery on the opposite bank had complete fields of fire. The Confederate infantrymen crossed that ground, knowing what was coming. They knew what it meant. They crossed anyway. That's not stupidity. That's discipline. They were following a plan their general had designed, a plan that failed them. Lee declared victory anyway. McClellan retreated to the James River. The 7 days total, Lee lost 20,141 men. McClellan lost 15,855. Lee had more casualties than the man he drove away, and he called it a win. Pattern number 1. Remember it. You will see it 7 more times. September 17, 1862, Maryland. McClellan had 87,000 men. Lee had 38,000. Lee knew this. Longstreet advised pulling back across the Potomac. Lee refused. I want to be specific about what this decision tells us. This was not a close call. Lee had accurate intelligence about the numbers. He had an experienced corps commander telling him in plain language to retreat. He had no strategic reason to fight in Maryland that outweighed a 2-to-1 numerical disadvantage, and he fought anyway. That is not courage. That is something closer to compulsion. The ground was wrong. The numbers were wrong. Lee fought anyway. 23,000 total casualties in 12 hours. The bloodiest single day in American military history. The cornfield at Antietam changed hands 15 times in 3 hours. Men who crossed it in the morning were buried under it by afternoon. The stalks were cut to the ground by rifle fire. Not by farmers. By bullets. Survivors described stepping on bodies so thick the ground felt soft. One Ohio soldier wrote, "I have seen the elephant now, and he is very large." Lee lost 10,316 men, over 27% of his engaged force. Proportionally, Lee bled worse than McClellan. After the battle, Lee held his ground for a day, then retreated. It was strategically a Confederate defeat. It handed Lincoln the success he needed to announce the Emancipation Proclamation. That announcement ended any realistic hope of British or French recognition of the Confederacy. Lee's aggression had handed Lincoln a political weapon that changed the war's entire international character. Antietam. Bowen's regiment, the 28th North Carolina, held the Confederate center near the sunken road. His letter home, September 23rd. I am alive. Many are not. I cannot write of it. Tell the children I am well. He doesn't describe what he saw. Men who've seen what he saw don't describe it. April 20th, 1861. Lee sat at the writing desk at Arlington House and wrote 2 letters. The first, his resignation from the United States Army. 32 years. Gone. The second letter is the one history quotes. I have not been able to make up my mind to raise my hand against my relatives, my children, my home. That line is real. But here is what the mythology carefully removes. In an 1856 letter, Lee called slavery a moral and political evil. He also wrote that he believed the suffering it imposed on black Americans was less than the anguish of the whites. That second sentence reveals something the first one tries to hide. He owned enslaved people inherited by his wife. He freed them in 1862, only because the will legally required it after 5 years, not before. On the day the law allowed him to keep them, he kept them. He chose to fight for a state whose secession declaration cited the preservation of slavery as its primary cause. Virginia's declaration is a public document. It doesn't hide this. Here is my reading of that letter. Lee was an intelligent man who needed a story he could live with. I fought for home is a story a man can live with. I fought to preserve the right of men to own other men is not. The letter gave him the first story. The historical record preserves the second one anyway. The mythology built a marble general who fought for home and duty. The letter built a man who chose a side and found the words to make that choice feel noble. Both things are in the historical record. Only one of them is in the statues. September 13th, 1862. Two soldiers of the 27th Indiana Infantry found a piece of paper in a field outside Frederick, Maryland, wrapped around 3 cigars. The paper was Special Orders Number 191, Lee's complete operational plan for the Maryland campaign. Every column, every march route, every objective, in Lee's own handwriting with his signature. McClellan had 18 hours to destroy Lee's scattered army piece by piece. He used those hours to write letters. By the time McClellan moved, Lee had been tipped off. He concentrated at Sharpsburg just in time. The mythology says Lee was a genius. Here is what the lost orders actually say about that. A genius does not lose his complete operational plan on the march. A genius does not depend on the enemy's incompetence to survive its discovery. Lee got lucky at Antietam, catastrophically lucky. The Marble General's Maryland campaign was nearly ended by a piece of paper wrapped around 3 cigars. When we remember Antietam as a near Confederate victory, we are remembering luck, not genius. Fredericksburg is where Lee looks like the marble general they built statues to. Ambrose Burnside sent 120,000 Union soldiers uphill against prepared Confederate positions. The Union lost 12,653 men in 14 separate assaults that never reached the Confederate line. Lee lost 4,201. Watching the carnage from Telegraph Hill, Lee said the thing that would follow him into history. It is well that war is so terrible. We should grow too fond of it. Most people hear that line as humility. I hear something else. I hear a man who found battle genuinely thrilling and was warning himself about it. We should grow too fond of it is not a sentence a man says lightly. It's a confession. Lee is telling us in that moment that he enjoys this. And that enjoyment, that pull toward the spectacular offensive engagement, is exactly what drove him to keep attacking when the mathematics said stop. He wasn't being glib. He was watching 12,000 men die and acknowledging to himself that he found something in it that alarmed him. The question is whether he ever acted on that alarm. At Gettysburg, 18 months later, the evidence says no. Bowen's 28th North Carolina held the Confederate South Line at Fredericksburg. His letter home, December 16th. We are all well yet. The fight was terrible. I cannot write of what I have seen. The cold is bad and worse than the fighting. Tell the children I think of them every night. He signed it. F.A. Bowen, Sergeant. He'd been promoted. Someone above him had died. May 1863. Joe Hooker brought 130,000 Union soldiers against Lee's 60,000. He announced, "The enemy must either ingloriously fly or come out to give me battle." Lee came out. He split his outnumbered army, sent Stonewall Jackson with 28,000 men on a 12-mile flanking march through the wilderness. While Lee held Hooker's attention with the remaining 14,000, Jackson hit the Union 11th Corps at 6 in the evening, like a hammer through paper. Hooker's position collapsed. By May 6, 130,000 Union soldiers had retreated back across the Rappahannock. Union casualties, 17,287. Confederate casualties, 13,460. Lee's greatest tactical victory. I want to make an argument here that most Civil War coverage avoids. Chancellorsville was not just a victory that cost Lee Jackson. Chancellorsville was a strategic loss disguised as a tactical victory. Here is why. Lee lost 13,000 men he couldn't replace. He lost the corps commander who made his entire offensive system work. And he gained, what exactly? Hooker retreated across the Rappahannock. He was replaced by Meade. The Union Army was still there, still larger, still better supplied. All Lee won at Chancellorsville was a 2-week window before the next campaign, and he used that window to march into Pennsylvania. Lee's greatest tactical victory also killed Stonewall Jackson. On the night of May 2nd, Jackson rode forward in the dark to personally scout Union positions. His own men, the 18th North Carolina, mistook his party for Union cavalry and opened fire. Jackson was hit 3 times. His left arm was amputated that night. He died 8 days later of pneumonia. Lee wrote to Jackson, "Could I have directed events, I should have chosen to have been disabled in your stead." He meant it. Jackson was irreplaceable. Without Jackson, Lee's flanking warfare became physically impossible. Lee went north to Pennsylvania 2 months later anyway. Bowen's regiment wasn't at Chancellorsville, detached near Suffolk during the campaign. He heard about the victory and Jackson's death in the same report. His letter from May 12th. "The General Jackson is dead. The men are quiet about it. I don't know what we will do without him. I am well. Tell the children I will be home when God allows it." Before we get to July 3rd, there's something you need to understand about the man making the decisions. In the spring of 1863, Robert E. Lee had a cardiac episode. The historical record calls it pericarditis, inflammation of the membrane surrounding the heart. He was 56. He experienced chest pain, arm pain, fatigue serious enough that he couldn't ride for days. At Gettysburg, witnesses noted he appeared unusually irritable, more rigid, less open to revision. Longstreet wrote, decades later, that Lee was not himself during those 3 days. The mythology never mentions this, because a sick man making desperate decisions doesn't fit the marble. But here is what I find significant about the timing. A man with a failing heart, leading an army he knew was being depleted, invading enemy territory without his best general. That combination creates pressure that distorts judgment in ways we now understand medically. It doesn't excuse what happened on July 3rd, but it explains why a man known for composure suddenly became rigid and unresponsive to sound advice. There was also overconfidence. After Chancellorsville, Lee told his staff the Army of Northern Virginia could go anywhere and do anything. He said it in those terms. After 3 consecutive victories, the men around Lee had started to believe their own legend, that this army was somehow exempt from the mathematics that governed other armies. That belief walked into Pennsylvania 3 weeks ahead of the troops. At the end of this battle, as the survivors of Pickett's division streamed back across the field, George Pickett rode up to Lee. Lee told him to reform his division. We'll come back to what Pickett said in response. It's 12 words. Those 12 words are the clearest summary of what Gettysburg actually was. The Battle of Gettysburg began by accident. Confederate advance elements under Harry Heth moved toward town looking for shoes. There was a rumor of a supply depot. They found John Buford's Union cavalry instead. By evening, Union forces had been driven back onto Cemetery Hill. By midnight, Cemetery Ridge was being fortified by 20,000 Union soldiers who understood exactly what they were doing. Lee ordered Richard Ewell to take the hill, if practicable. Ewell determined it wasn't. He didn't attack. Historians still debate whether Ewell was wrong. My view, the debate misses the larger point. Lee's vague discretionary orders, if practicable, worked with Jackson because Jackson always attacked. With a different commander in a different situation, that same order produced paralysis. The failure wasn't Ewell. It was a command style that only worked when the subordinate was Stonewall Jackson. And Jackson was dead. On Little Round Top, a Maine College professor held the end of the world. Colonel Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain, 20th Maine Infantry, 358 men, the far left flank of the entire Union line. Confederate General Evander Law sent 5 Alabama regiments against him, again and again. The 20th Maine ran out of ammunition. Chamberlain ordered the bayonet charge. The men came down that hill at a dead run, empty rifles, fixed blades, screaming. The Alabama soldiers, spent from 5 uphill assaults in July heat, broke. It wasn't heroism alone that saved Little Round Top. It was surprise. The shock of men doing the one thing nobody expected. What history remembers less. The men of the 5th and 48th Alabama charged that hill 5 times in suffocating heat, carrying 40-pound equipment up steep rock. Colonel William Oates of the 15th Alabama lost his brother there. He spent the rest of his life trying to get a monument erected to the Alabama dead. The Park Service denied it for decades. They were fighting for a cause worth condemning. They were also human beings doing the hardest thing human beings can do. I think we can hold both of those truths simultaneously. In fact, I think we must, because the moment we reduce them to symbols, we lose the actual moral weight of what this war cost. You are James Longstreet on the morning of July 3rd, 1863. You've watched your corps lose 9,000 men in 48 hours. Your commanding general wants to send 12,500 more across open ground. You believe, professionally and mathematically, that it cannot succeed. He outranks you. He has final authority. Do you obey, resign, or find a third option? That is the exact choice Longstreet faced. Lee's plan for July 3rd, frontal infantry assault across 3/4 of a mile of open ground, 12,500 men, against a fortified position on high ground. Longstreet argued against it, not once, multiple times. He told Lee, no 15,000 men ever arrayed for battle can take that position. Lee ordered the attack. Have you ever heard 150 cannons fire at once? Not in a movie, in reality. The concussion alone can kill at close range. Windows shatter a mile away. The sound doesn't travel like sound. It travels like a physical force. It presses against the chest. It defeats thought. Lee heard that bombardment for 2 hours on July 3rd, and when the guns went quiet, he gave the order to advance. The artillery bombardment lasted 2 hours. 150 Confederate guns fired. It looked devastating. It wasn't. The gunners couldn't see through their own smoke. Most shells overshot the Union line. Union artillery Chief Henry Hunt pulled his guns back from the crest to save ammunition. He let Confederate observers believe they'd succeeded. It was a trap. And Lee walked into it. Edward Porter Alexander sent a message to Pickett. Come at once, or I cannot give you proper support. He believed the Union artillery had been silenced. It hadn't. The Confederate formation stepped off at approximately 1:30 in the afternoon. 12,500 men walking in rows as if on parade, flags flying, formations dressed. An extraordinary thing to watch. Then the Union guns opened from 3 directions at once. The ground beneath Sergeant Bowen's feet didn't just shake, it roared. A mile of sulfur and smoke that swallowed the sun. Men around him dropped without ceremony. The soldier to his left simply stopped existing. The formation closed the gap and kept walking. Bowen was in Pettigrew's division, left center of the assault. The 28th North Carolina took enfilading artillery fire almost immediately. The regiment had 292 men at the start of the charge. The muster roll afterward shows, wounded, July 3rd, next to Bowen's name. He survived. We don't know what he saw on that field. Some things a man doesn't write home. The Virginia brigades reached the stone wall. General Lewis Armistead led them over with his hat on his sword. He was shot within seconds of crossing. The breakthrough lasted 4 minutes. It was surrounded and destroyed. 6,500 men in under 1 hour. Every person alive today in Green Bay, Wisconsin, gone in 60 minutes. Pickett's division, all 3 brigadier generals killed or wounded. All 13. Regimental commanders killed or wounded. 2/3 of the men, casualties. Stay for the final 10 minutes. What happened after the guns went silent is the part nobody talks about. When the survivors streamed back across the field, Lee rode among them. He said, all this will come right in the end. All good men must rally. He found Pickett and told him to reform his division. Pickett looked at him. General Lee, he said, I have no division. Those 12 words. General Lee, I have no division. Let me tell you what I think those words actually contain. They are not just a report of casualties. They are a verdict. They are a subordinate officer, still in shock, telling his commanding general, you asked for something that could not be given. We tried to give it anyway, and this is what trying cost. Lee had ordered an attack he'd been told couldn't succeed. It didn't succeed, and the instrument he'd ordered the attack with was gone. Edward Porter Alexander sat near his guns and waited for the Union counterattack he was certain was coming. He'd sent the message that triggered the advance. He'd watched 12,500 men walk into the fire. He'd watched them come back. The Union didn't come. George Meade chose not to pursue. Alexander walked among his gun crews in the quiet after the charge. Most were still alive, but they were silent in a way he hadn't seen before. Not exhaustion, the silence of men who'd watched what they helped cause and couldn't look away from the accounting. Alexander counted his remaining ammunition. He noted that if Meade had pushed, there was no answer. There was nothing left to give. He was 28 years old. He didn't tell Lee what he thought. He waited 40 years to write it down. In 1907, Edward Porter Alexander published Military Memoirs of a Confederate. He was 72. It was not what Confederate veterans wanted to read. Alexander praised Lee's genuine strengths, specifically and concretely. He called the Chancellorsville flank march as brilliant as anything in military history. Then he named the failures, by name, by date, with analysis. On Gettysburg. The assault of July 3rd was unjustifiable. It violated the principles of war. If he'd understood what the charge would cost, he would not have sent the message to Pickett. That sentence cost him. Former Confederate officers stopped speaking to him. He'd served this army from First Bull Run to Appomattox, and he still told the truth about it. Here is what Alexander actually believed, written in private correspondence after the war, that the Confederacy might have prolonged the war if Lee had adopted Longstreet's proposed defensive strategy. Hold ground. Make the Union pay the offensive price. Use Confederate manpower efficiently instead of offensively. He never published this in full, but he wrote it. It's in the archives. The man who watched Pickett's charge from Seminary Ridge believed in his private moments that none of it had to happen the way it did. That is a weight he carried for 40 years. It comes through in every chapter of his book. Grant arrived in Virginia in the spring of 1864 with a strategic approach Lee had never faced. Grant didn't maneuver for brilliant battles. He understood something Lee never did. Winning a battle and winning a war are not the same calculation. Lee's whole career was built on the first one. Grant's career was built on the second. That difference decided the war. He attacked. When Lee stopped him, he moved south and attacked again. He didn't care about the optics of any individual battle. He cared about where Lee's army was at the end of each month. And at the end of each month, Lee's army was smaller. Union casualties in the Overland Campaign, approximately 55,000. Confederate, approximately 33,000. The Union replaced their losses within weeks. Lee could not replace his. Cold Harbor, June 3, 1864. Grant made his own version of Lee's mistake. Frontal assaults against prepared Confederate positions. 7,000 Union casualties in 1 hour. Grant called it the one order of his life he regretted, but Cold Harbor didn't end Grant. He shifted the entire Army of the Potomac south of the James River, bypassed Lee's lines completely, laid siege to Petersburg, and waited. Lee sat in trenches watching his army dissolve through desertion and starvation, while Grant built a railroad and let time do its work. The mathematics had been pointing here since 1862. They'd arrived. Bowen's final surviving letter, February 1865. His handwriting is worse, not from injury, but from 3.5 years of cold and hunger. We are hungry. The rations are not enough. I think of the corn harvest and the children. I do not know how much longer this can go on. He was 26 years old. 620,000 to 750,000 dead. Every person alive today in Denver and Seattle combined, gone in 4 years. The Army of Northern Virginia alone, approximately 209,000 casualties. Every living resident of Richmond, the Confederate capital, taken 3 times over. In every major offensive engagement Lee personally directed, his percentage casualties exceeded his opponents. This is not a controversial claim. The records are clear. The math is public. The only thing protecting Lee's reputation from those numbers is the mythology that was built after he died. Robert E. Lee surrendered at Appomattox Courthouse on April 9, 1865. He shook Grant's hand. He became president of Washington College in Lexington, Virginia. He died 5 years later from a stroke. He was 63. He never expressed public regret. He never publicly acknowledged slavery as the war's cause. He opposed black suffrage. He wrote in 1866 that the country was not ready for racial equality. The statues came later. Most were built between 1890 and 1920, the height of Jim Crow. Deliberate political statements about who owned the South's memory. A second wave in the 1950s and 60s during civil rights. They were never about honoring a soldier. They were about asserting a version of history. And the version they asserted required stripping away everything this documentary has shown you. Edward Porter. Alexander died in 1910. He wrote the most honest insider account of Lee's command ever published by a man who loved him. He told the truth. That's rarer than it sounds. Francis Bowen came home to Yadkin County in the spring of 1865. The 1870 census, 12 acres, his wife, 3 children. He gave no speeches. He wrote no memoir. He went back to farming. He planted corn. He was 27 years old. Robert E. Lee was a skilled operational commander. His flanking movements at Second Bull Run and Chancellorsville were genuine brilliance. He read terrain. He inspired loyalty. He maintained composure under pressure. These things are true. I want you to hold them alongside everything else. Here is my verdict. And I want to be clear, this is an analytical conclusion, not a political one. Lee was a first-rate tactical mind in a job that required a first-rate strategic one. Those are different skills. We gave him credit for both when he'd only earned credit for one. And the gap between what he was and what we needed him to be cost the Confederacy the war, and cost 200,000 soldiers their lives. But operational skill is not the same as strategic vision. His strategic vision, the belief that enough blood could force political settlement, was wrong from the beginning. He never understood that the war was about mathematics, not battles. He never grasped that every offensive action ate his army faster than the enemy's. He looked east, always east, partly because it was home, partly because that's where the drama was, and Lee, for all his Christian stoicism, responded to drama. Grant understood what Lee never did. The goal was not to fight brilliant battles. The goal was to destroy the enemy's capacity for war. Lee's greatest victories contained the seeds of his defeat. Each win was also a wound. The history books built a marble general. They needed a myth more than they needed a man. When we protect a complicated figure by stripping away the complications, who are we actually protecting? And what does it cost the people who weren't protected by anything? Francis Bowen walked home in April 1865. He'd been gone 4 years. He'd been at Antietam, Fredericksburg, and Gettysburg. He'd been wounded on July 3rd, 1863, and gone back. He planted corn. He raised his children. He never talked about it. 14,000 men, walking, across an open field, toward 9,000 rifles already aimed. The general who ordered it wasn't a fraud. He wasn't a fool. He was brilliant, genuinely brilliant. And every single man in Green Bay, Wisconsin, paid the price for that specific kind of brilliance aimed in the wrong direction by a man who never stopped to ask whether winning the battle was the same as winning the war.